Well, first and foremost, it was about pursuing your passion. I
Mm-hmm.
wanted to be a musician. And I thought through my involvement with two or three different rock bands and one jazz band that, you could make something of yourself. I was always taught growing up that choose carefully what you want to do in life and then become the very best you can be. But it's got to be based on following your passion and not what anybody else tells you to do. Well, the music career didn't turn out to be anything significant. It was a lot of fun, but a lifelong career it wasn't to be. So then life kind of unfurls itself as it does for a lot of people in their late teens, and you kind of move on to some things that you also consider pretty important. And service overseas as a missionary to me was something that was a valuable thought that was consistent with where I thought my life needed to go at that point, which is as much about helping others as it is learning about yourself. And that was an invaluable experience in that for the first time you're living overseas in a lengthy period of time, and it shakes you out of your sense of reality, and it puts you in a different environment from which you learn a great deal. And in my case, it sort of altered the overall trajectory that then life would take, which really was then to focus on a region of the world that I knew very little about, but one that I could tell was going to be fundamentally important to the future of my own country. And therefore, the language and the economics and the politics of East Asia were all things that absolutely fascinated me as I returned. Well, the relationship between China and North Korea, which traditionally has been, I'd say, more transactional than ideological, I think is a little bit frayed. And I say that because, leaders do business with other leaders. And in the early days of China and North Korea, there was common cause between those leaders, whether Mao Zedong or Deng Xiaoping and Kim Il sung. You get down to today's leaders, and I think in China, many of the emerging members of the fifth generation see North Korea as a major irritant. They have an economy now to manage. The Chinese do. They didn't have much to lose in the early days if things went south, but they have a real economy to manage these days, and not least of all the northeastern tier, Manchuria, Dongbei, which is a thriving economy that borders North Korea. So that's one area. I think the second area is their profound fear of nuclear weapons proliferation and what a rogue North Korea might mean to the region as it relates to Japan, South Korea, maybe even Taiwan. So for them, the stakes are very, very high, and they know that managing North Korea is going to be an ongoing challenge for them. And that becomes particularly difficult when the regime that you're trying to do business with in Pyongyang uh, goes against everything they promise, or won't take your advice, or when the West thinks that, gee, China can deliver messages to the North and that will just solve the problem. It just doesn't happen anymore. Well, for somebody who used to make fun of those who ran for public office, here I found myself doing it later in life. The private sector years were very important because we were involved in building a family business, a business that we never thought we'd have, we didn't deserve, and all of a sudden it started gaining critical mass, and it became a large, viable operating entity. And we never expected that. Didn't have it early in life. And so dedicating a part of my career uh, to help with the company that carried our name. I was involved with my dad and with my brother, who's now the CEO. And, the philosophy that then sort of derived from that success in those years, which is if we're lucky enough to make anything, we're going to give it back.
Mm-hmm.
We don't deserve it, quite frankly. And, when you die, what are you going to do?
Right.
You're going to be measured by what you did for your community and society as opposed to what you have in your bank account. So then, kind of the philanthropic chapter uh, was pursued,
Mm-hmm.
including the establishment of a cancer institute,
Mm-hmm.
which is really a living legacy of what my folks thought was the most important thing we could do with any kind of business success. So that kind of informs your thinking about capitalism, enlightened capitalism, and what companies can do when they're profitable to make our communities better, reaching for solutions and problem solving that are well beyond what a government can do. Those were important insights. And then you go back into government service, which I did after an 8-year or so hiatus, and you're back in the foreign policy area as a trade ambassador, which gets you right in the saddle of negotiating, as we did, several free trade agreements. It was a very ambitious, I think very successful run at international economic diplomacy. And after about 2.5 years of that, and never seeing my kids, some of whom were in high school at the time, they sat me down and basically said, we'd like to have our dad back, traveling 250 days, a year away from home. They wanted a dad back, and rightly so. And I asked them what they thought I should do. I was doing what I was trained and equipped to do and pretty good at doing. And they said, we think you ought to go out and run for governor of Utah, our home state. And I told them I thought they were crazy, that I'd never do anything like that I probably was totally unelectable. And they said, well, let's talk. And we took a couple of weeks to kind of talk about the pros and cons. And it became quite clear to me that sometimes people on the outside can see you better than you see yourself and what some of your strengths and weaknesses are. And Utah was in need of an economic boost. It needed an infusion of new energy and new ideas, kind of moving into the 21st century. And the more I thought about it, the more intrigued I was with the idea of taking real issues and real solutions, road testing them during a campaign, something I'd never done before, and then standing before the people and asking for the vote and living with whatever the result was. And we entered the political fray shortly thereafter and spent a whole year in a Suburban, our family, crisscrossing the state, parks and restaurants and people's living rooms. In some cases, one person would show up. In some cases, 50 would show up. In other cases, angry folks would show up. And then you begin to create a little bit of momentum. And people, after having heard you enough in terms of your rationale for running, they say, I like what you're saying. I think I could actually vote for you. We're going to watch you and hear you out a little bit more, but I think we could actually support you. And then you realize that, people are listening to you and your ideas might be catching on. And so we created a platform of really specific ideas. I call it the 10-point economic plan that I subsequently gave to Rick Snyder, who's now the governor of Michigan. Last time I saw him, he said, I've almost got all 10 of those points implemented. And we carefully put together this plan based upon input from the outside, people who really knew what they were talking about. I had my own gut instinct about tax reform, the right balance on regulation, incentives, bringing new industries into the state, the implications for education and how you retrain and retool a generation of workers. But we put a very specific plan together. I took it out on the campaign trail. I said, here's the best I can do. I've done it with stakeholders. I don't know if they're going to support me or not. I don't know if they're Republican or Democrat, but they care about the state. And all I can tell you is if I'm elected, I'm going to do my best to get these 10 points implemented. I think it will do a lot of good for the state. I also kind of ran on a reform platform, which was term limits, sort of eschewing a lot of money, outside money in politics, and later more kind of structural reform that was focused on ethics and best practices, only to find that not everybody likes that stuff. And the people do, but the political class oftentimes is not very much in favor of that. So we took that plan, ran it all the way to the finish line. I didn't vary at all. I just promised the folks what I'm going to do, and I think I'm well equipped to do it. And I've got sort of the infrastructure by way of good people who are willing to take us there. And we made it all the way to the end. Then you wake up the next morning and you look back on the last year and say, we did it. We crossed the finish line. Now we got to make this happen for real. It isn't just talking during a campaign to rooms full of people who might cheer you on. Now you got to make it a reality in people's lives. And that's the most challenging yet liberating aspect of being a governor. You can actually make things happen, pull the levers of power and decision making, and then be held responsible for what you make happen. I'd been exposed enough to the political milieu.
Mm-hmm.
I'd worked at the federal level, and I'd seen where government works and where it doesn't work, and the coalitions you have to build around issues to actually make them happen, the role of the media, the role of special interest groups. And so that was all stuff that I had dealt with before.
Mm-hmm.
But I was pleasantly surprised once in office, where if you were specific enough with what you thought you could do as opposed to broad generalities that really don't mean much to people, you actually had an action plan that you could then take to the legislature, you could take to the Chamber of Commerce, you could take to civil society, you could articulate through your State of the State speech, so long as it was focused and honed into something that was simple enough and real enough to get done. And, it took us a couple of years to get some of it, like tax reform. We did a flat tax, which everybody said was impossible. You just can't, you can talk about it, but you can't do it. We did it. It took us 2 years. I failed the first year. We got it done the second year. And just a lot of other things that were part of education reform and getting the economy back on its feet, and public and private cooperative efforts like the Utah Science, Technology, and Research Undertaking, immigration reform. We did environmental things that were kind of non-traditional at the time because everybody cared about them. Healthcare reform. And I was amazed at how much you could do as governor if you were specific and focused on solutions.
Mm-hmm.
And I just, you have to tee up the issue and explain why it's important to actually address as a population, but then you have to tee up practical solutions, which today are a little elusive in the political world. Well, that will remain within the family council, but whatever happens over the next couple of years, I think it will be driven by, first and foremost, ideas.
Mm-hmm.
I think in Republican politics, it's less about personality. Everybody likes to play the name game. Who the top 10 people, say the leading magazines, here are the top 10 people who are in line for 2016. I think that's nonsense at this point. And I say that because 2016 or beyond will be driven by ideas and people behind those ideas. And based on real ideas that average Americans hear out, and they're able to say, I can relate to that. That is me and my community, and that's my future.
Mm-hmm.
And then people associated with those ideas will begin to pop up. But I think traditionally we do it this way, which is kind of cart before the horse. We talk about people, and then ultimately we get to some issues later on in the campaign, because I think that's what sells content,
Mm-hmm.
moves content. Where in reality, I think it's going to be, how do we reconstitute the foundation of what it means to be a Republican? That has to be thought through carefully in line with the original ideals of the party.
Mm-hmm.
It's got to be reconstituted, repackaged, rearticulated by new people. And depending upon what that content is and how it falls upon the ears of the voters, that will then provide opportunities for people, or it won't. So where you can say, gee, it'd be great to run again just for the sake of running, I'm not of that school. I say you either rise to the occasion based upon what it is you stand for and what you think you can do, and that will come later, or not. And if not, the cycles of history and politics are simply against you and your ideas. I think the two-party system has served us pretty well,
Mm-hmm.
traditionally. When you have a strong dominant party and then a weak secondary party, the imbalance, I think, is harmful
Mm-hmm.
in terms of checks and balances and ultimately good decisions being promulgated. So I'm in favor of a strong two-party system, and that means strengthening the Republican Party. Uh, but the Republican Party needs to have an orientation that focuses on problem solving. We've always been a big, bold problem solving party. You just look at history all the way back to Abraham Lincoln. We embrace the problems of the day and we find solutions that are good for all the people.
Mm-hmm.
And that then will, I think, bring in the broad middle who are just saying, who's representing me?
Mm-hmm.
Who believes in actual problem solving and doing the work of the people as opposed to griping on, the political extremes of the political spectrum. So that middle you might be talking about, I like to call it the problem solvers.
Mm-hmm.
Some call it the middle or the moderates.
Mm-hmm.
I think we're all saying the same thing, and that is, in the end, we as Americans, generally speaking, are optimistic blue sky problem solvers.
Mm-hmm.
That's who we are. And that part is missing in politics right now. And whoever captures that element, I think, will be very, very successful. Whichever party owns the tag of being a problem solver, I think will own the next few election cycles.